Let's create a project from the scratch. New project. It's not visible, but it's Spring Boot Starter. Next, let's call this as Spring AOP. And here we will select Spring Web. Next, finish. I have used Gradle. It's your choice to select Maven on Gradle. And here you see we have Spring Boot Starter Web. So what I'm going to do is I'll copy this and just change this to AOP and synchronize. Let me add the rest of the code and we'll see the part of the code. Apart from this dependency, what I have done here is I have created a class called order, which will have the ID and the list of items. We are making it as simple as possible, will not complicate the things. So this will store the order information, and we have custom order controller. It has a list of orders to store the orders and the ID to increment. Here we have place an order, which just creates an order and adds it to the list. Getting an order returns the order based on the ID, and deleting an order removes the order from this list of orders. And in each of these methods, we are just printing the business logic just to see the logs. And we have created an aspect for this custom order aspect, and the aspect class should be annotated with @aspect, which is of aspect j, and component from Spring. If you do not annotate with component, so this aspect is not going to be useful. Here in this aspect class, we have implemented the advices before, around, after returning, after throwing, and after. So basically what these mean. So before advice is being executed just before executing the business logic. Around advice is being executed around the business logic, in a sense before as well as after. That can be made assured by calling this join point dot proceed. We'll see what these all proceeding join point dot proceed are in detail in our further videos. For now, just remember that when you call this join point dot proceed, business logic code can be called by this, and whatever the code is being implemented before this executes before the join point or before the business logic, and whatever we have will be executed after the execution of the business logic. And after returning is the advice that executes after successfully executing the business logic. We are calling this part of the code as the business logic. And after throwing will be called if there is an exception thrown from the business logic method. And after is like finally, irrespective of its success or failure, after will be called. Basically, you can just try to understand or try to remember these three as try, catch, and finally of Java. So this is like catch, the code executed within the catch block, and this is like the code executed within the finally block, and this is like if there is no failure and we are returning from the application, then this part will be executed. What we have done here is we have implemented all different kinds of advices, and for each of these advice you see here is an expression. This expression is the point cut. So we have the aspect here, we have the advices, and each of the advice has the point cut expression. To make it simple initially, what I have done is I have added the same kind of point cut expression to all of these advices. So what happens is this advice basically says to execute these advices on every method of the customer order controller class. For this controller class, we have three methods, and each of these three methods are the point cuts for all of these advices. You see there is something called execution star, and here star and dot dot. So we'll get into these details later. So this basically represents a method that returns anything. Star means anything, and you know this package name, full package name, and the class name. Dot star is any method in this controller class, and dot dot in essence any number of arguments for this method, which means this matches all the methods present in the customer order controller. To make it simpler, we are just logging here whichever the method is being called before, around, and after, and all that stuff. So we have defined aspect, we have defined advice, we have the point cuts, and these are the join points. These methods, whether it is before or after or around, these are the join points, all of these methods. Now we need to make sure that the aspect oriented programming or the Spring AOP is enabled. For that, what we can do here is @enable AspectJ auto proxy. You can add this, but this is not needed because by default, this annotation, Spring Boot application annotation, makes sure that the AspectJ is enabled. How that is done? If you go to this annotation, here you see there is something called enable auto configuration, this part. And this enable auto configuration annotation makes sure to check your code and dependencies, and based on that, it figures out what all features or functionalities are being implemented and whether to enable them or not. So for us, this annotation itself makes sure that the AspectJS auto proxy is enabled. Let's try to execute this, run as Spring Boot application. And since these are the REST APIs, all of these are REST APIs, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Postman app. Here I have already added these, the get API, this one, the post, and delete. Let's try to create an order. Place an order, and I have two items, samosa and pizza. Send, and an order has been placed, and this is what the data looks like. And if you see the logs here, for each of our aspects, this is the order in which the execution has taken place. The around has been started. This is our around advice. Here, this is executed, and once that is done, proceed is called. Then the proceed makes sure that before advice is executed, before, and then our actual business logic is executed. Where is it? This part. You see here we are printing. So this is what the business logic means. And since this is successfully executed, what happens? After returning is being called. And after returning, since there is no exception, after throwing is not called. And then, so this is done, the finally method should be called, or the finally advice should be called after advice is called. Since our around advice is not completed, because this is what is being executed until now, up until now, and once this finally is done, the rest of the around advice is executed, this part, and the response is returned. Let's say, if you see, if I try to get the order, I will see the order, and the same order of execution of each of those advices remain. What if I try to get the order which is not there? So it throws an exception. And if you see, the order of execution remains similar, but there is some change. So around advice start, and then before, and then the business logic executes. Business logic throws the exception. Here in our case, this part of the code, getting the order, throws the exception. And since we have the exception, after throwing is called, and then the finally is called. If you see, after the finally, we will not see the part of the code from the around advice. In a sense, you'll not see this part of the code to be executed because the exception has occurred here, and the exception will be thrown from here itself. There is no execution of this part of the code, and that's the reason we do not have anything here. So this is the order of execution. Let's try to see a diagrammatic view of this execution. Basically, what we are trying to understand is the order of execution of each of these advices that may help us to know which all advice will be executed at what specific time when all of the advices or few of the advices are being executed on one specific join point. Let's see the flow of execution or the order of advice execution using the success scenario. Here you'll see at the corner the log from our execution. So basically what is happening is the request, whenever a request requests the actual business logic, the around advice is executed first. And once this around advice comes to that join point, it invokes before advice. Here, remember that around advice is not yet completed. So the before advice is being called and the before advice is executed. Then the actual business logic is executed. And once the business logic method is successfully returned, it goes to the after returning advice. The after returning advice is executed, then a finally advice is called, then the around advice is continued. And once the around advice completes, the response is being sent to the caller. With this order of execution, we can say, let's suppose on this business logic method, we did not have the around advice join point. We had only before, after finally advice, or after returning advice. In that case, what happens? This is how the order of execution takes place. And if suppose the before advice and the after returning advice was not present, but the around advice and after finally advice was present, then this is how the flow of execution of the advices and the business logic take place. In case of failure, what happens? Similar kind of execution takes place. The request comes to the around advice, and then before advice is being executed, then our actual business logic method is executed. On failure of this business logic method, after throwing advice is being executed. After that, after finally is executed, and the response is sent back to the caller. And here the response is not some data, but an exception. And similar kind of logic applies to the failure order of execution as well. So here we saw very high level of flow of execution for different advices on a join point or the business logic. In our next video, let's try to understand very detailed information about the flow of execution to try to understand what exactly is happening inside the Spring framework. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching.